Picture this. You are a woman in the year 1830. It's early morning in a cold market square in Yorkshire. The stone street under your old boots is slippery with frost. Your breath makes little clouds in the cold air. Around you, voices are rising. But this sound isn't joy, it's something heavier. You feel fear, and maybe a strange kind of hope. Around your neck is a rough rope, like the kind used to lead animals. Your husband is holding the other end of it. His hand is dry and cracked. From years of hard work, his voice echoes through the square. He sounds like a man selling a cow. "What will you give me for this fine woman?" he shouts. He's had a few drinks already to calm his nerves. She's strong, got good teeth. She can cook and sew. The crowd starts gathering. Some are curious. Some look disgusted. Others look like they're doing math in their heads, calculating your worth. A few men come closer, checking your hands to see if you're a hard worker. Others look at your face, trying to decide if you're pretty enough to share their bed. Your heart is beating fast. In just a few minutes, your entire life might change. You could end up with a man kinder than the one who brought you here, or someone far worse. But what scares you the most isn't the sale itself. What scares you is that this is legal. This isn't a secret crime. This isn't madness. This, in the strange logic of your world, is your best hope at freedom. Your only way out of your marriage. This was the strange, painful truth of something called wife-selling. It didn't begin just because men were cruel, though cruelty was often there. It came from a legal system so strict and unfair, poor people had no good choices left. To understand why so many men once brought their wives to be sold in market, squares with ropes around their necks, we have to look at a time when women weren't treated as people, but as property. In Victorian England, there was a law called coverture. This meant that when a woman got married, her legal identity disappeared. A famous legal scholar, William Blackstone, once wrote that the woman's very being was suspended. When she married, everything she was became part of her husband. The law called her a femme covert, a covered woman, covered by her husband's name, his money, and his choices. It was like she was invisible. Imagine a working-class woman in the 1820s, let's call her Mary. Before marriage, she could earn money, sign contracts, and even sue someone in court. But once she said her wedding vows, it was over. Any money she made now belonged to her husband. If her parents left her an inheritance, that was his too. Even the dress on her back belonged to him. If her husband, let's call him William, beat her until she couldn't stand, there was no law to protect her. He had the right to correct her, just like he might scold a child or train a dog. If he drank away all their money, or brought diseases home from brothels, or refused to work while she washed clothes until her hands bled, the law still sided with him. But what happened when Mary couldn't take it anymore? What if William's beatings left her ribs broken? What if their children went to bed hungry every night? What if Mary met someone else, a kind man who treated her with respect? In the upper classes, there was divorce. But it was so expensive and complicated that it was almost impossible. Before 1857, divorce needed a private act of Parliament. It cost at least £1,000, about £118,000 today. That was more money than most working people would ever see in their lifetime. Even after the 1857, law made it easier to divorce through court. It still cost around £40 more than a year's wages for many labourers. So for poor people, there were only a few ways to end a marriage. They could agree to separate, but they couldn't remarry. They could run away and hope their spouse didn't follow. They could try to get a church separation for adultery or extreme cruelty, but it cost money and didn't allow remarriage. Or they could die, or finally, they could sell their wife. The idea probably began in the late 1600s. Since women were seen as property, people began to believe they could be sold like any other item. The process became strange and humiliating, but also strangely formal. It was like a twisted version of both divorce and remarriage done in public. Usually, it started with an ad in the newspaper. The words sounded like an animal sale. For example, John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is strong, healthy, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Sometimes, the ads were even more blunt. One said, Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. On the day of the sale, the husband would lead his wife into a public place, usually the same market squares, where animals were sold. Sometimes they used taverns or pubs. She'd wear a halter, a rope, or ribbon around her neck, arm, or waist. It showed that she was being transferred like livestock. Then the husband, often acting as auctioneer, would call out, "What am I offered for this fine woman?" He might add that she could sew, cook, bear children, and had good teeth. Men would come forward, checking her hands for signs of hard work, judging her looks, maybe even asking her to speak. But here's something important. Many of these sales weren't actually random. In most cases, the sale was planned ahead of time. The buyer was often the woman's lover. The sale was a public performance that allowed everyone to see the marriage was over and a new one had begun. It was humiliating, yes, but also a way to make things feel official in a world where the law gave them no help. In one case, from Brighton in 1826, a woman was sold for £5 to a sailor. She didn't seem upset. The paper said the sale happened with good humor. Most likely, the sailor had been courting her, and the sale was the only way the three people could make a new life. Another woman in 1830, whose husband got cold feet at the last minute, told him, "Let be, you rogue. I want to change." Her voice still echoes across time, strong and unafraid. The prices paid for wives varied wildly from over £100, with extra for children, to as little as a single glass of beer. But money wasn't the point. What mattered was the act of doing it in public, with witnesses. The rope was handed to the new man as a symbol that the transfer was done. Some sales even had written contracts that sounded like property deeds. One said, "I, John Parsons, for £6.06, sell my wife Anne to John Tucker, with all rights, claims, and services for the term of her natural life." Afterward, everyone might go to a pub to celebrate. In one case, the church bells even rang. The town treated it like a public event, part play, part court case, part fair, but not all wife sales were planned or fair. In 1766, a carpenter sold his wife while drunk. When he sobered up and asked her to come back, she refused. He later hanged himself. In 1824, in Manchester, a wife was sold for 5 shillings. She didn't like the man who bought her, so they started the auction again. She was sold a second time for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. Sometimes the woman could refuse a buyer. But imagine standing there while strangers decide your fate, treating you like a cow or horse, hoping someone better will step forward. Yorkshire saw more wife sales than anywhere else. In Halifax, 1837, a blacksmith sold his wife for 1 shilling, then bought her back, then sold her again. When the wife found out, she beat him in public. One of the most dramatic stories happened in 1849. A man named Ashton was in the hospital when his wife ran away with her lover. He tracked them down and held a public sale in Yorkshire. After a bidding war, the woman was sold to her lover. Before leaving, she laughed at her husband and said, "That's more than you would fetch." Even children were sometimes included. In 1865, a woman and her 2 children were sold together, £100 for her and £25 for each child. The buyer wasn't just buying a wife, but an entire family. The law didn't officially support wife selling. It had no legal standing. But many local officials didn't stop it either. In one case, a judge who tried to stop a sale was chased away by the crowd. He later said, "I'm not sure I had the right to prevent it. It was a custom of the people." Some officials even supported it. In 1814, a poorhouse told a man to sell his wife rather than have the parish pay to support her. The sale went ahead, and the local government paid for the travel and wedding dinner. These market sales weren't random. They were held in places where the public could witness them: livestock markets, busy streets, town squares. The symbolism was powerful. These were the same places where property was exchanged, where animals were priced. By holding these rituals in public, people were asking their communities to accept what the law would not. Some sales even priced women by weight, just like animals. That wasn't a joke. It was the natural end of a system that legally treated women as things, not people. By the 1840s, things began to change. Newspapers started calling these sales disgusting and shameful. Middle-class society was becoming uncomfortable with what they saw as working-class nonsense. Courts began to crack down. More people chose private, written agreements instead of public sales. Reform groups, including the Salvation Army, preached against it. But even reformers weren't immune. In 1889, a Salvation Army member sold his wife in Nottinghamshire for 1 shilling. The final known sale happened in 1913. A woman told a court she'd been sold to her husband's co-worker for £1. By then, it was more a tradition than a belief, but still rooted in desperation. In the end, the real horror of wife selling wasn't just the public humiliation. It was what that ritual revealed about the world these people lived in. These weren't wild, uncivilized people. They were ordinary people trapped in a system that refused to recognize women's rights or humanity. When the law gave them no way out, they made their own paths even. If those paths were painful and strange, the women who stood in those markets, ropes around their necks, weren't only victims of their husbands. They were victims of a society that didn't see them as human. A society that offered no escape from violence, poverty, or sorrow. But some of them used this twisted system to find hope, to find love, to find a second chance, even if that second chance cost them their dignity, their pride, and a few shillings. The people who came to watch wife selling weren't just there for fun, though for many it was entertaining. But deeper than that, they were watching something that the legal system couldn't handle. It was a community trying to fix problems that law ignored, using their own version of justice. It was crude, it was public, but it was a solution when no other options existed. In 1860, Arthur Munby saw what he called the fine old custom in a small Yorkshire village. An elderly man sold his younger wife to another man for 18 pence. The buyer hesitated, unsure if what he was doing was legal. Eventually, he decided it was, but the local people didn't agree. They made figures of the couple and burned them in protest. A clear sign that even in places where wife-selling still happened, many found it troubling and wrong. This wasn't just something poor people did either. It crossed class lines, even if the upper classes pretended it didn't. The Duke of Châteaux, around 1740, bought a woman from an abusive husband for just half a crown. He sent her to school, married her when her husband died, and they reportedly had a happy life. When she passed away, her final words to her household told her story and reminded them to trust in fate. Even among the wealthy, wife-selling could end in love. That's what makes this practice so hard to understand today. Yes, it was humiliating. Yes, it treated women as property. But in a twisted way, it was sometimes the only escape from a life of misery. The record shows many women weren't dragged into these sales against their will. In 1822, in Plymouth, one woman even paid to arrange her own sale. In other cases, women pushed for the sale even when their husbands had second thoughts. For many of them, this wasn't just a cruel tradition, it was the only way out of a bad marriage. They weren't always helpless victims. Sometimes they were the ones steering the ship. Still, that doesn't make it right. It just helps us see why. It lasted for over 200 years. People used the only tools they had. The system had no mercy for poor families. A man might earn just 10 shillings a week. Families lived in one room. Children worked 12-hour shifts in factories. Life was hard. Marriage, for the rich, could bring companionship or status. For the poor, it was usually just a survival deal. And when it failed, when husbands drank away their wages or beat their wives, or when a wife couldn't have children, there were no support systems, no real divorce, no place to run. Churches offered moral lessons, but no help. The law punished, but didn't protect. So, communities came up with their own solution. Wife-selling. It wasn't just about getting rid of someone. It was about fixing what couldn't be fixed any other way. Newspapers often reported these events with disgust and judgment. Middle-class writers called the crowds savage, the husbands cruel, and the women pitiful. But hidden between the lines, you can read something else. Stories of people stuck in impossible situations, trying to find a way out. Looking back now, it's easy to see it as barbaric. A woman standing in a public square with a rope around her neck, being auctioned like cattle. It was degrading. But it was also something else, a form of control in a world where people had none. For women, it was the only way to escape a violent home. For men, it was a strange way to reset their broken family lives. It was ugly, yes, but it was also survival. Eventually, wife-selling faded, not because society grew more kind, but because divorce laws slowly changed. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave women small but important rights. They could keep their wages and inherit property. The law began to see women not just as someone's wife or daughter, but as people. But for the women who had stood on those cold cobblestones with ropes around their necks, those changes came too late. They lived in a world where they had no legal name of their own, no control over their earnings, no safety from abuse, unless they were sold like animals. And their stories remind us of something important. Progress isn't automatic. The rights we have now to divorce, to own property, to be seen as equals, were earned through pain, often by those who never lived to see the change. They also remind us that when laws fail, people will always invent their own kind of justice. It may be rough, it may be wrong, but it comes from a place of desperation. Imagine now standing in one of those markets. The sun's just rising. The cobblestones are still wet with morning mist. You're surrounded by the smell of hay, animals, and fear, not from livestock, but from a woman being led onto a platform. Her name could be Sarah. She's 28, maybe. Her hands are rough from years of work. Her face is tired. Around her neck is a thick rope, the kind used for horses. Her husband holds the other end, barely meeting her eyes. "Come now, gents," he calls. "What'll you give for her?" Strong as an ox, never complains, still has all her teeth. He forces her mouth open for the crowd to see. Men step forward. They inspect her hands for strength, her hips for childbirth, her face for beauty. One man, a blacksmith, pinches her arm. "She's a bit thin," he says. "Will she last?" "The winter, she's sweet as a lamb," the husband replies. Never raises her voice. Good with children, but look at her eyes. They tell a different story. She's not weak. She's not helpless. She's watching every move, calculating. This might be her one shot at freedom. The bidding begins. A cattle dealer offers 2 shillings a joke. A young farmer, red-faced and shy, calls out 2 and 6. He's never been married, and maybe he's lonely. Maybe he sees this as a solution. The woman glances at him, trying to guess if he's kind or cruel. Then a new voice calls out, 3 shillings. It's Thomas. Miller, a man she knows, someone she's been meeting in secret. Relief flashes across her face. This sale isn't random. It's a performance to make their arrangement look legal. But the young farmer doesn't get it. "For shillings," he shouts, "and I'll throw in a pig." Now the woman's face tightens. This wasn't part of the plan. She looks to her husband. He's not paying attention. He's too busy thinking how many drinks he can buy with the money. 5 shillings. Thomas tries again, but the farmer keeps bidding. 6, then 7 and a pig. The crowd is loving it, but she's scared now, really scared. She might be sold to a stranger. She might never see Thomas again. 8 shillings. Thomas yells, though everyone can see he can't afford it. And then something rare happens. "I choose Thomas Miller," the woman says loudly. "I'll go with him, but I won't be sold like a sack of grain." Silence, then murmurs, then cheers. An old man calls out, "Let the lass choose. This ain't a cattle market." The farmer, though he bid higher, backs down, maybe with relief. The husband, realizing he's lost control, quickly agrees. 7 shillings, then, and she goes willing. Thomas steps forward. He hands over borrowed money. He takes the rope off her neck and throws it aside. The crowd claps. The show is over. She curtsies. They walk away together. But as the crowd leaves, you realize something. Yes, she escaped a bad life, but now she's tied to Thomas. If he turns out cruel too, she's stuck. She's traded. One cage for another, hoping this one has softer bars. The young farmer watches them leave. A part of him feels cheated, but another part sees the truth. This wasn't just a market transaction. This was about ownership. And ownership, when it comes to people, always feels wrong. The husband, now with 7 shillings in hand, heads straight for the nearest tavern. He's lighter, freer, but something nags at him. That woman he sold, she may have feared him, but she also might have been the only soul who cared if he lived or died. That scene never happened exactly like that, but it mirrors many real ones. Take Mary Ann Price, sold in Wales in 1837 for 4 shillings and 6 pence. The paper said she was young and good-looking, and the sale went smoothly. She went to a man named Lewis, who was described as her sweetheart. But behind the words, there's more. Her husband was a drunk. The mines were collapsing. She didn't choose to be sold because she wanted a new husband. She chose it because it was the only way to survive. Or the case from Carlisle in 1832. A woman was put up for sale, but she refused every bidder. Sometimes they said no, even when no one else would listen. Because in the end, wife selling wasn't just about humiliation. It was about survival. It was about people, women, mostly trying to take control in a world that gave them none. And those ropes around their necks, they weren't just physical. They were legal, social, and emotional chains. Ones we still work to break today. The crowd grew tense. People had come expecting a transaction, but the woman kept refusing every man who tried to buy her. Whispers turned to shouting, and things got so heated that a local magistrate had to step in to stop the situation from turning violent. Eventually, she was sold to a man she'd never even met for just 3 shillings. But she refused to leave with him. The sale was declared invalid, and she was allowed to go back to her husband. What happened to her after that, no one knows. This moment shows the strange contradiction behind wife selling. On one hand, the custom acted like women were property-like objects that could be traded. But on the other hand, for these sales to be accepted by the public, the woman usually had to agree. If she clearly didn't want to be sold, the crowd often turned against the sale. Even people who came for the spectacle sometimes stepped in to protect her dot. Wife selling wasn't evenly spread across the country. Most cases came from Yorkshirean area with poor rural communities and fast-growing industrial towns. In the wealthier south, the practice was far less common. And in Scotland, with its different legal system, it was almost unheard of. In the industrial north, everything was changing fast. Families no longer worked side by side on farms. Husbands and wives often had separate jobs, routines, and social lives. When their marriages broke down, there wasn't always a family or community structure to step in. Wife selling became a way to deal with modern problems using old customs. The halter usually tied around the woman's neck was more than just a symbol. In the eyes of English common law, property could be transferred by a physical handover. This was known as livery of season, an old legal ritual. Using a halter in a public marketplace followed those ancient rules. It gave the sale a thin layer of tradition and legitimacy. The halter also worked on a psychological level. For the man selling his wife, it was a way to feel he had the right to let her go. For the man buying, it marked ownership and responsibility. And for the woman, the moment the halter was removed was often when she mentally shifted from one life to another. Some of these sales were drawn out and degrading. In Sheffield, 1842, one woman was sold 3 times in a single day. Each time, the buyer changed his mind, and she was dragged back into the crowd to be sold again. Witnesses described how she became more distressed with each sale, eventually breaking down in tears. These repeat sales showed just how unstable the whole system was. There was no real law behind wife selling. No way to enforce it. If a man regretted buying a wife, he could just give her back. If a woman hated her new situation, her only choice was to beg to be sold again. Children often got caught in the middle. Sometimes they were part of the deal, like extra goods added to the price. In one 1847 case, a buyer agreed to take care of a woman's 3 children along with her. But more often, kids were left behind, separated from their mothers, without understanding why. Their stories are mostly lost to history, but the pain they must have felt is easy to imagine. Watching your mother led away by a stranger with a rope around her neck's a memory no child should have to carry. Wife selling wasn't just a personal matter. It was a public event, drawing crowds by the hundreds or even thousands. People came to watch, but they also came to judge. These crowds played an active role. They could approve a sale, interrupt it, or reject the buyer. If someone tried to sell his wife to a man seen as cruel or dishonorable, the crowd might stop the whole thing. This shows that wife selling was deeply tied to the local community and its sense of fairness, even if the system itself was flawed. As the 1800s went on, wife selling lost its place in society. Britain's growing middle class began to see public displays of working class marriage breakdown as shameful. Newspapers called these events disgusting and cruel. At the same time, religious revival movements, especially Methodist and Baptist, spoke out against the practice, saying it was morally wrong. The legal system was slow to act. Before 1850, punishments were light, just a small fine or a few days in jail. But as public opinion shifted, courts got tougher. By the 1860s, a man could face 6 months in prison for selling his wife. Buyers could be charged with conspiracy to commit adultery. Still, proving a sale had actually happened was hard. Most people denied that money had changed hands, or claimed it was just a joke. Sometimes, even juries didn't want to convict. Many came from working-class communities, where wife selling was still seen as, not approved as, a way to solve a hopeless situation. Meanwhile, the music halls were turning the whole thing into comedy. Songs like The Sale of a Wife made fun of the situation. The husband was the fool, the wife a troublemaker, the buyer a sucker. These performances made the harsh realities of wife selling look like light-hearted fun. But the very fact that the topic stayed alive in popular culture showed how deep the issue ran. It spoke to people's fears about love, money, and power in relationships, issues that didn't disappear just because the practice did. Wife selling also crossed borders. English settlers brought the custom to parts of America where it continued. Into the 1800s, court records from Connecticut to South Carolina show that it adapted to new environments. In the US, wife selling was often even more commercial, with newspaper ads and formal sale documents. The French were fascinated by the idea, horrified but intrigued. Newspapers there reported on wife sales with dramatic flair. Political cartoons mocked Britain by showing men leading their wives to market like animals. For British elites, this was deeply embarrassing. They wanted Britain to be seen as a beacon of morality and civilization. But wife selling told a very different story. Another key part of the ritual was alcohol. Many of these sales started in taverns, fueled by drink and loud conversation. Alcohol made the unthinkable seem normal or even funny. It gave men the courage to go through with the sale, and later gave them the excuse to say they hadn't meant it. But courts rarely accepted these regrets. A sale was a sale, drunk or not. Economically, wife selling made a kind of desperate sense. In poor communities, marriage was often more about survival than love. Women needed protection. Men needed help. At home, when things fell apart, wife selling offered a brutal but practical way to reshuffle resources. A woman who was young, healthy, and skilled could fetch a higher price. One known for her work ethic, say in brewing or spinning, was more valuable. These weren't emotional decisions. People were calculating labor, fertility, and domestic ability. Newspapers sometimes captured details that gave us a window into working-class life, what women wore, what was said, how people behaved. These scraps of information reveal a strange kind of etiquette around the practice. There were unwritten rules, right places, right prices, right rituals. If you broke those rules, the community might step in. After 1850, wife selling became less common, not just because of changing morals, but because life itself was changing. Factory jobs gave some women financial freedom. Cities made it easier to disappear. Railways made escape possible. Ideas about marriage were changing too. Love and companionship were starting to matter more than just economic stability. The women's rights movement, though small and mostly middle class, gave people new ways to think about gender and relationships. By the early 1900s, wife selling was seen as something from a darker time. The last known case in England happened in 1913. In Leeds, a woman said her husband had sold her for £1,000 to a workmate, but it wasn't a public event. There was no crowd, no platform, no halter, just silence on judgment. By then, legal. Divorce was more accessible, though still difficult and expensive. New welfare programs, while limited, gave people more options than before. The brutal choice between being sold or suffering in silence slowly faded away, but the legacy of wife selling lingers. It reminds us what happens when the law fails to protect people. It shows what people do when trapped in impossible situations, and it raises questions that are still relevant today. What happens when people can't afford legal help? When systems are too rigid to help real people? When survival demands a price no one should have to pay? The women who stood in those market squares weren't just victims, they were survivors. They made the best choices they could in a world stacked against them. Some found better lives, some didn't, but all of them, every single one, paid a price in dignity, in self-worth, in silence. Their stories aren't just history, they're warnings, reminders, questions they ask us. Are we building systems that serve people, just protecting principles? Are we making progress for everyone, nor just a few? The markets are quiet now, the halters are gone, but the questions remain. And in those questions, maybe, just maybe, there's hope.